working together in Baghdad, translated the Greek works into Arabic. And this is how cross-fertilization of knowledge across civilizations took place for the first time in human history. Before this, development of knowledge had taken place. Creation of knowledge had taken place. And the best example of creation of knowledge was Takshashila in India. For 400 years, Takshashila produced outstanding thoughts. It was a Takshashila that Chanakya developed his mind. It was a Takshashila that Charak developed his thinking on medicine. It was a Takshashila that Vishnu Sharma develops literature. For 400 years, Takshashila developed, but it was all indigenous knowledge. It was all Indian knowledge. And similarly, there were centers of learning elsewhere in the world. There was some work done in China and elsewhere. But it was the first time that through the efforts of Mamun of the Abbasid Caliphate, that you had the bringing together of knowledge from different parts of the world to create a universal knowledge, to create a universal concepts and the cross-fertilization of knowledge. And this is how in the middle of wars, in the middle of conflict, one international think tank, very solidly backed by the state of Abbasid Caliphate, created the reality of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam through knowledge, bringing together this knowledge of over 1500 years. If they had not done that, we would not have known much of the knowledge that was developed in India ourselves, or we would not have known much of the Greek and others. It was all totally lost. I mean, Aristotle's importance today is all due to the Abbasid Caliphate. You would have never heard of him. Now, interestingly, there was a war between the Abbasids of Baghdad and the Umayyads of Damascus, and the Umayyads went to Spain and they settled there. The Abbasids took over what is today's Syria, Baghdad, so Damascus, and they settled in Spain in Cordoba. And they took over part of Spain and part of southern Europe. Now, while the Abbasids translated works from Greek and from Sanskrit and from the Chinese into the Arabic, the Umayyads translated the works from Arabic to the Latin. And eventually, then with the European Renaissance and the developments that took place in the Europe in the 14th, 15th century, the work got translated slowly from Latin to the Indian language, to English. So the algebra that your students your children are studying or grandchildren are studying in the schools in Mumbai today has traveled from its birth in India to childhood in Arabic to Latin to English. So the civilization that we see today is really a joint venture. It's a collaborative venture. It would be absolutely ridiculous for Americans to say that they have developed science and technology which is capable of taking you to Mars, because it has a foundation of last 2000 years. You can't ignore. If there had been no mathematics, you wouldn't be having any space science. Your entire space science is based on computer science, physics. All these sciences are further based on mathematics. There would be no medicine today had there not been the work done by Avicenna and other people during the Abbasid Empire. So the civilization today is a collaborative effort. Your knowledge, your livelihood, your habits, everything, this microphone, everything today that is produced has come as a result of 2000 years of collaboration. And it's only through knowledge, and it's only in the sphere of knowledge that the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam has been created. In the area of politics, in the area of resources, you have conflicts. In the area of land management, you have conflicts. In the area of economics, you have conflict. But despite all these conflicts, beginning with the Abbasids up till now, you have you have used the knowledge to really create the oneness of the universe, or a shared value or shared premise for the advancement of human civilization. And what is happening today? This tradition is continuing. One of the most interesting experiments that's taking place right now as we speak is in producing the fusion nuclear energy. See, currently the nuclear energy is fusion by splitting the atom. But the biggest development that will ever take place in nuclear energy will be if you can fuse the two atoms. That experiment is taking place, and it's happening in France. And who are the people who are collaborating there? In an area which is extremely sensitive. It's nuclear energy. It's not just nuclear energy, but it's the most advanced nuclear energy. And who's working together on this? The Chinese and Indians, along with Europeans, Arabs and Israelis. In an area which is the most security sensitive area. They are working in France. They are not only working, they are not only just deploying, and this is not the Indian scientists living abroad. These are the Indians in India. These are not PIOs. And these are not Chinese resident of California. These are Chinese in China. And if you analyze the budget, which comes out on the 28th of February every year, you would find, if you analyze last year's budget, for instance, you will see in the expenditure line about 100 crores given by the government of India to ITER, this International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. Last year it was 100 crores. Every year the amount changes. So every year the government of India from our taxes is contributing to this experiment. And so it is. So in the most advanced area you have the collaboration taking place. You would remember that a few years ago there was this epidemic of SARS. And unlike AIDS, SARS just disappeared. The fear of SARS just disappeared in a matter of few months. At one stage, it looked like SARS would kill millions of people. How did you manage to control SARS? What you could not control, we have not been able to control cancer. We have not been able to find solution to tuberculosis that fast, though tuberculosis is now coming in control. We have not been able to manage so many other diseases. How did we manage SARS, which was a completely new virus? How did you manage to control that in a matter of 1 year or so? It's because the moment SARS broke out, laboratories in 13 countries worked together. And they worked in a collaborative way. And this is how, within a matter of few months, we could contain SARS. And there were laboratories in India, there were laboratories in US, there were laboratories in China, again in Europe, they were working together. So the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is of cross-fertilization of universal values, because at the end of the day, what matters is the values. And the knowledge expresses the values. So that is taking place for last 1500 years. And it's happening even now. It's happening much less than it should happen. That's a different question altogether, but it is happening. You have the Large Hadron Collider under Geneva on the border of France and Switzerland. 75 countries are collaborating. There are 7 universities in India which are participating in this. And this is not just the TIFR. TIFR, of course, is the leading partner, but even you have the university in Punjab and Haryana and in Madhya Pradesh participating in this research. So you have the humanity has used knowledge to really bring about cross-fertilization of ideas, cross-fertilization of thought processes, cross-fertilization of values through this knowledge. And if you really want to make Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam or oneness, universal oneness, or the concept of universe as a family, the world as a family, then you need an instrument. And a shared development of knowledge is one instrument which has been proved over the last 1500 years, and which is what will help you to go ahead. In recent Indian history, one thought leader who understood this very well, and that was Swami Vivekananda. This year there is a 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. From last September, I got several invitations to come for 150th anniversary celebrations. I turned all of them down. Because when I asked these organizers who were organizing these events about how much actually they are following Swami Vivekananda's teachings, all that they could tell me was that they are doing some social work. There was nothing more concrete they could provide. And I'm not talking about one or two organizations, I'm talking about a large number of organizations. No, social work is good. I'm sure Swami Vivekananda would approve of social work. But that was not core to his message. How many of you have read the Chicago speech? How many of you have read Chicago speech? The text? Yes? So if you read, you will see the speech which was given on the inaugural day. The key words that he has used, it's that all religions in the world should follow the principles of universal acceptance and tolerance. These are his precise words. These are not my words. These are the words of Swami Vivekananda. And in fact, he was speaking in Old English, so he didn't use the word tolerance, he used the word toleration. But I would translate it into the modern English to say toleration to tolerance. Okay. And then again towards the end of the speech, he comes back and he emphasizes that what we need is the universal acceptance and toleration or tolerance. He didn't say Hinduism is more superior to Islam or Islam is more superior to Christianity and all the religions should be in conflict with each other. He said the key to a healthy society, a key to a desired society is for all religions to understand the principle of universal acceptance and tolerance. That was a key message, but that was only one message that, or one part of the message that Swami Vivekananda gave. There was a second part of the message that Swami Vivekananda gave after he returned to India from there. And that second message was that philosophy itself is not enough. See, the first message was more or less philosophical. That philosophy must go hand in hand with technology. And which is why the first scientific institution in the country was created by Swami Vivekananda, not by any scientist. And he got financial assistance from Raja Wadiyar of Mysore and from Jamshedji Tata of the Tata Group. So with their financial assistance, he launched a study for the a Society for the Study of Science, Study and Promotion of Science. And from that society came into being the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. So Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore is founded by Swami Vivekananda, not by a professional scientist. And because Swami Vivekananda belonged to an era when India was not independent and there was no politicians running the government, though unfortunately there were foreign rulers running the government, there was no force on him to accommodate somebody's son or daughter as the director. And as a result, Swami Vivekananda had a freedom to invite somebody who really deserved and who really knew how to run that institution as the director, and he chose a person. First, initially there were a British director just in the setting up stage, and then later on the person who took over the director was Dr. C.V. Raman, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics. So Swami Vivekananda understood that the way you can bring about progress of a nation, the way you can build a nation, and the way you can create stability and peace in the world, the linkage between the two, because you cannot live in a nation when peacefully the whole world is unstable, and you cannot work for a stable world if your own house is not in order. And the way to do this is to promote the concept of universal tolerance and universal and acceptance of all religions, and secondly to promote the scientific temperament. And that these two things have to go hand in hand. So in today's world, if you really want to create the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which has been given to us as a gift by the ancient rishis and the ancient sages in India, what are the lessons that we can draw from the last 1500 years of history? First of all, one lesson which is clear from the Abbasid experiment, from the message that Swami Vivekananda gave, and the message that and the experiments which are taking place at ITER and everywhere, that it's only through collaboration that you can progress. There is no alternative to collaboration. There is no alternative to cooperation. And this collaboration, this cooperation has to happen at all levels. Not just collaboration between institutions, collaboration between different constituents of the society, collaboration between different religions. And unless and until an Indian political party comes with an agenda, comes with a program as to how different religions, different castes, different segments of the society, of the Indian society can creatively and constructively work together, we will not realize our full potential. That is absolutely essential. National Integration Council. But that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, that's one bureaucratic organization where you accommodate every possible politician who has lost this election. So, if you want really to build a nation and at the same time you want to contribute to building a society, to building a global society which is based on the principles of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which are the Indian values given by our sages, I think the first priority is to see how we can bring about creative and constructive cooperation. And I think creative and constructive cooperation, that is very important. It is not just coexistence. And of course, you can only have creative and constructive cooperation if you follow Swami Vivekananda's message of universal acceptance and tolerance. So I would have expected that in the 150th year of Swami Vivekananda's birth anniversary, that those who are following his message will come out with some concepts as to how do you take this message of universal acceptance and tolerance to the next level. And the next level is the creative and constructive cooperation between different communities and different religions of India. And none of them has been able to present to me that they have even thought about this. All they say that we go to a village and we do some social work there, and we go to some slum area and we do some social work there. And nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a good idea to do some social work and to look after the underprivileged people of the society. But if you are saying that you are celebrating the 150th anniversary of Swami Vivekananda, and if you assume that, if you assume for a moment that the genetics had developed at that time as it is likely to develop in the next 50 years, then Swami Vivekananda would be probably alive today. In which case, if in 1893 he gave a message of universal tolerance and acceptance, what is the message that he would give today? How would his thoughts advance? That is what he should have thought. And nobody has come out with this. But leave aside what has been lost, I think this is what we need to work towards in future. And I hope that since Vishwa Adhyayan Kendra has Adhyayan in its middle name, I hope you will give some thoughts to see how you can take this message ahead of how to build a society which is based on constructive and creative cooperation between different constituencies, between different constituents of the Indian society. The second lesson that we can draw from the experience and the teachings of various people is that you have to have science and philosophy going together as the two main wheels of your society. Here in Mumbai, they think share market and real estate market are the wheels of the society. They are okay, they are important, they are required, they are your day-to-day realities. But they are not the wheels of the society. If you want the Indian society to move ahead, if you want to build a nation, if you want to do a Punarnirman, if you want to create a new India, then we have to seek how science and philosophy both can play a central role in taking the nation ahead. And then once we decide as a society that these are the two elements which are most required, then there can be a lot of debate as to how to go about it. Not that there has to be a full agreement across the country. But science and technology, they have to go ahead. Now, with regards to science and technology, let us see where we are and where we can go. Let me ask, somebody wants to be a volunteer, I want to ask a question. Anybody? Okay. What's your name, sir? Okay. What is the most significant development taking place on the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala?
Basically, these two South Indian countries, states, they are trying to overcome all their poverties, and they are working very hard towards improving their cultural this thing. Although they have big fight between themselves, but individually they are trying to progress faster.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Professor Page, you want to try?
Yeah, the famous dam issue between
the Idukki dam. Huh?
Yeah, it is a water problem
Sorry?
that they are
No,
going
one at
to
a time.
solve.
One at a time. Yeah. Okay. Okay, you.
The same thing I want to do.
Okay. So the water dispute, the how will you summarize what he said?
yeah, the water dispute in two states regarding the sharing of the water, A, and B, the dam which is likely to collapse according to the Tamil Nadu government.
Okay. Now, of course, there is no correct answer to any question like that because this is a very subjective question and there are various answers. But I will tell you what I think is the most significant development taking place in the border areas of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Okay. Before that, let me just step out of India for a minute and let me look at what is the most significant development taking place in the whole world. And then I will come to Tamil Nadu and Kerala in a minute. The most significant development taking place in the whole world is an effort being made to challenge the laws of physics, and especially the laws as laid down by Einstein. Now, if you change the laws of physics, or if you find that the laws of physics are wrong, even if by a small percentage, and if you find that some of the laws of physics need to be revised or relooked at, the whole world will change. Everything will change. Right from your space missions to your microelectronics to everything, absolutely everything will change. If you find that there was some problem in the laws of physics as explained by Einstein, everything will change. So the most significant development, that's one of the two most significant developments taking place, that's anywhere around the world, is the whole questioning of the basic laws of physics, and particularly the law which says that the light, that the speed of light is the fastest traveling phenomena, and there is nothing that can break the speed of light. Now there is only one thing that has come close to breaking the speed of light. And for a moment the scientists thought it had actually broken the speed of light. Then they realized that there was some technical flaw in the experiment and they withdrew. And that was last year when they found that neutrinos, which is a small particle, had broken the speed of light. But then they realized there was a mistake in this scientific experiment, and neutrino has not actually broken the speed of light, and so the Einstein's theory remains valid. But still neutrinos are important because they are the ones which come very, very close to the speed of light. Just very, 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 very close. I mean, there's the speed of neutrino is maybe 99.999999% of the speed of light. So the work on neutrinos is going to be the second most important work that's going to happen in the world, and that is what is going to decide how the world will be shaped over the next 500 or 1000 years. What comes out of the experiments on experimental work on neutrino will decide, will be one of the 2-3 things that will decide. There is also corresponding work taking place on molecular biology that will also play a role in how the world will be shaped over the next 500 to 1000 years. So neutrinos, I would say not number 1, but definitely one of the 2-3 programs which will decide not just 400 years, 500. This is a lot more important than your value of rupee or whatever. Mr. Kelapuri said that what you are going to say today is less important than the value of rupee. But I can tell you, Mr. Kelapuri, the value of rupee is an issue which is relevant for next 10-15 days. The laws of physics are going to be important for next 1000 years. Or maybe next 10,000 years. So, now this, so therefore, along with what's happening in molecular biology, along with what's happening in the creation of life in laboratories, and along with what's happening at the Large Hadron Collider where they are working on the Higgs boson, the work on neutrinos is the most significant, one of the 5 most significant developments taking place in the world, not only taking place in the world today, but in the world over the last 100 years, which will have an impact over next 1000, next 2000, next 5000 years. And the world's largest neutrino observatory or laboratory is being built on the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So what happens on the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala is going to determine, or going to, I would not say determine is too strong, but is going to influence how the entire universe works over the next 1000, 5000, 10,000 years. And you think that a damn issue is more important than this? And that's not your fault. It's frankly the fault of the Indian media. Because you are not aware. I'm sure if you had known that there is a largest neutrino observatory being built on the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, of course you would have recognized that this is the most significant development taking place there. But the Indian media has very different kind of priorities. I'm in fact surprised that they are talking about the dam dispute on the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, because I thought their priorities were a lot more significant, like the color of dress that Priyanka Chopra or whatever her name is wears at the evening parties, and for how much money the cricketers are auctioned. So cricketers being auctioned is your front page news. Amitabh Bachchan tweeting about some issue here or there is your front page news. And the Indian scientists have built the world's largest, are building the world's largest neutrino laboratory, is something that Indian media doesn't think is important enough to communicate to the Indian public. But because the media is shallow and because the media is, has got its priorities wrong, doesn't mean that everybody in India has got their priorities wrong. Fortunately, the scientists and even the bureaucrats whom we all blame are, have the right sense, and they are putting in resources and they are putting in effort to build this. And this is not an exceptional experiment. Not too far from here, in Pune, last year, something came up in Pune, and that's in the field of biology. Asia's first biosafety level 4 laboratory is in Pune. It was set up last year. Now, this is the only laboratory in Asia, perhaps with the exception of China, because in China what happens you don't come to know. So, at least in terms of what is the public knowledge, this is the only laboratory. And by Asia, I don't mean mostly East and Southeast Asia. I'm not talking about the West Asia, where Israelis would have it anyway, underground or overground. The first, and the Israelis, I must say, I admire them in some ways, that they will do all this, even dare to do it in Haifa, not too far from the border of Lebanon. Despite all the worry of missiles coming from Hezbollah or whatever. So, so Asia's top first biosafety level 4 laboratory is in Pune. And this is a small news on page number 9 of the Times of India. But even though the media thinks it's not important, the government of India provided 75 crore rupees to set this up last year. So all these politicians and all these bureaucrats whom you blame are actually a lot more sensible than we give them credit for. Despite all their weaknesses and all their corrupt practices and all their problems, which we all recognize and which we must fight against. We should not accept corruption. We should not accept criminality. But we must understand that they are doing something constructive out there. So when we look at creating a base of science and technology, you have some very good experiments taking place in India, right from theoretical physics to molecular. Now, this laboratory in Pune would be able to detect and work on any case of bioterrorism in the world. So, if you have a problem with bioterrorism, you can come to Pune and you can consult this laboratory, you can try to solve the problem. And bioterrorism is going to be a significant problem, and you have a solution right here in Pune, or at least an effort to find a solution right here in Pune. But while the government is doing this, and while there are also many experiments taking place at the grassroots level, for instance, in Pune itself, there is a small company which has created a tool whereby a mobile phone can dial a electric pump half an hour away and see whether there is electricity or not, and so that help the farmers to save his trip. And there are many such small experiments taking place. The organized Indian private sector is missing from this effort, and it's a shame. You had Institute of Science in Bangalore, which was established in 1919. You had Indian Institute of Technology. The whole plan of that was finalized in 1940s, just before 1947, though the first Institute of Technology was actually inaugurated by Pandit Nehru after he became the Prime Minister, but the entire planning and everything was done before 47. CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, was set up in 1943. TIFR was set up in 1946. And TIFR and Institute of Science both came into existence because of Institute of Science because of Jamshedji Tata, and TIFR because of J.R.D. Tata. So the Indian private sector played a tremendous role prior to the independence in creating foundation for advanced science and technology in India. What have they done since 1947? Give me one example in the private sector. There's a lot that's been done by the government. There is the Chandrayaan, which was created by ISRO, which is in the government sector. There is this biosafety level 4 lab, which is the latest, which I mentioned. This is done in the government sector. There are so many things which are done in the government sector. What is being done by the organized private sector? Mobile phones, internet. Since have they invented it? All imported. All they have done is just the CKD, just the assembly. And what is the result of that? The result is that in some critical areas, because you can't really go ahead only with the effort of the government and the small-time experiments which are taking place at the grassroots level, India is falling way behind. For instance, one of the most critical tools today in any field, whether it is biology or whether it is chemistry, is the computers. Without the computers, you can't do chemistry. Without the computers, you can't do biology, you can't do anything. The fastest supercomputer that we have, that is in China. And the Chinese computer has a speed of 54 petaflops. Now, 1 petaflop is 1,000 trillion calculations per second. So 54 petaflops means China has a computer which is the only computer in the world which is, there is no such computer in the US, no such computer in UK, Japan, not even in Israel, not in Japan, not anywhere else, which is capable of thinking at a much faster rate than the human mind. Because human mind thinking goes to about 20 to 30 petaflop. The second fastest computer in the world, so the first is 54 petaflops China. The second fastest computer in the world is owned by the US military, and that is 18 petaflop, which is 1/3 of the Chinese speed. So this is where China is 54 petaflop, this is where US is 18 petaflop. And the fastest computer in India is 0.18 petaflop, which is 1/100th of the fastest US computer and 1/300 of the fastest Chinese computer. And why these things is happening? Because Dr. Karmarkar, who developed this super fast computer of 0.18 petaflop, was rewarded in the very next month by termination of his job. So this is how our private sector behaves. You develop a supercomputer, you are thrown out of a job. So we don't want to produce anything, we don't want to invest anything. Recently, there is a whole crop has come of private sector people being involved in setting up of the educational institutions, both private sector, both private sector and the political private sector. And sometimes I'm invited by these institutions to meet with the directors. And I tell them, I said, look, you people are stupid. You have very small ambition. So they say, how? I said, yeah, we have to make money. I said, no, you have to make money, but just in terms of making money, your ambition is extremely small. Because what is your model? You want to take a capitation fee of 20 lakh rupees from a student, and then you will have 100 students or 200 students, whatever, and altogether your business will be some 50 crore rupees a year. Mr. Pankaj Bhujbal is not here. I don't ask him. I would have asked him what is the turnover of MET. I won't ask Mr. Page and put him in a trouble. Only 5 crores. So you have at the most 10, 15, 50 crores of business, and you are happy with that. I said, you are lacking ambition, you are just happy with these 40, 50 crores, and that's about it. I said, instead of that, I'll give you another model whereby you can make at least 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 crores a year. Now, if you take this to your board, you have to pay me a royalty. You just keep this in mind. I said, the model is this. You don't charge any fees at all to any of the students. So they say, then how do we make money? I say, don't charge any fees, and you admit students completely free of charge, and moreover even look after their books and boarding and lodging and everything. But take a very rigorous test to see their research potential. And let them, along with studies, engage in research. Some of them will come out with new products. Some will fail. Some will come out, fail in terms of producing new products, but some will come out with new products. Some of them, you register an IPR for them. Some of them will become global brand names, because if every institution is producing so many products, some are bound to hit the global, and you will make billions and billions of dollars out of that. You share the IPR, you take 80%, give the student only 20%. And still, you will be, student will be happy and you will be very rich. And this way you can earn 1,000 crores, 2,000 crores, 5,000 crores. But I said, but you people are not capable of thinking behind 10, 20 crores. That's a problem. Since we have a friend from Israel here, in northern part of Israel, I have a friend or an acquaintance called Steph Wertheimer. You may be knowing his name. Steph Wertheimer is an Israeli businessman, an industrialist. He single-handedly produces 10% of Israel's GDP. So 10% of his salary is coming from Steph Wertheimer, from the taxes he is paying. So he produces 10% of Israel's GDP single-handedly, maybe 12%. Now what Steph Wertheimer does, he has created an industrial estate called Tifan Industrial Estate in northern Israel. And there, anybody who has an idea to produce a new product which can stand international competition, he gives them full support, free of charge. He'll give them an industrial unit in the Tifan Industrial Estate. He'll give them financial support, he'll give them marketing support, and he'll give them all kinds of support. He even has set up a museum there for their entertainment and other things. And then, some of these people with this kind of a support automatically go out and produce products which dominate the world market. And Stephan Wertheimer is the most prominent example of this kind of a practice, but there are a lot of other people in Israel who do that. And there are a lot of people in US who do that. There is not a single Indian industrialist who is doing that. And when I ask the Indian industrialists, why don't you do it? They say, we have to still mature as industrialists, we have to make money. So I have acquaintance in China. He was selling garments, chaddars, bed sheets to New York. And he reached a turnover of $600 million. And he thought $600 million is a big amount. I don't want to waste my time in producing these bed sheets anymore. And so he created a laboratory from his own money for nanotechnology and to produce new kinds of paints. And and within a year or two, he succeeded in producing paints which cost only 5% of the international market prices of the best paints that are available. Only 5%. So now you have to compete with him with 5% of the cost that he's incurring. He didn't say, I want to have $6 billion turnover, only then I'll do it. With $600 million, he started doing it. So it's a question of mindset. It's not a question of resources. So the second principle that we need is, the first is plural society, a constructive and cooperative relationship between different communities, different religions. The second is an innovative, dedicated emphasis on science, technology, and along with that philosophy. And philosophy is very important too. Because technology without philosophy can cause destruction. This is what happened in the Second World War. This is how nuclear bomb came into existence. This is how bioterror weapons will come into existence. This is how a lot of other things, negative things destructive things will come in. Technology with right kind of philosophy makes creation possible. So you need technology and philosophy both. For those who understand Marathi, Tattvagyan and Tantradnyan, these are the two wheels which we need to have together. And so in China, currently the most popular person is a guy called Zhao Ziyang, who is a philosopher. And people are discussing his philosophies everywhere. You ask who is the most popular person in Mumbai, you probably debate between Sachin Tendulkar and Shah Rukh Khan. So, science, technology, philosophy, they have to go together, and unless you have them going together, you cannot achieve. The third and the final point that I want to make today is that if you want to contribute to building a Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and if you want to build a good nation, there is no alternative to good governance. unless your governance is based on certain principles, you cannot have any hope for your future. Today, India's problems are on various fronts. There is a problem of poverty, problem of inflation, problem of corruption, but at the root of it is problem of governance. And unless you have good governance, you cannot have any hope at all. Now, how do you bring about good governance? That is a subject by itself. But first of all, we must recognize that we need good governance. How much of recognition is there in our mind? And how much of dedication we have to have good governance? Since we don't have a dedication, the Supreme Court sometimes forces us to have dedication. So about a week or two ago, I may be wrong about the date, Supreme Court came out with a verdict that the politicians who are in jail cannot be in the parliament. So the government is so brilliant, decided to introduce a law whereby this Supreme Court's verdict can be bypassed and the politicians who are in the jail can be in the parliament. This is how innovative we are. And there was absolutely no protest from anywhere in the public. Every time a woman is raped, we go and protest out in the streets, and we must. We cannot allow the women of India to be raped. But the whole society of India is raped by government's decision to neglect, to override Supreme Court's decision, and we are completely quiet. A rape is a rape of a woman and a rape of the entire nation. Both are rape, and rape should be protested and rejected. And there are a number of other examples that we are completely immune towards what's happening in governance. And we are immune, but somebody else is doing it, court is doing it, judiciary is doing it, somebody else is, other institutions are doing it. And we just find beautiful ways to whitewash these efforts. And then the other thing that we are good at is we blame the other. And nowadays we have even developed new expertise, our nighttime TV debates, where the television anchors take a big pride in organizing confrontation between political parties and getting the BJP guy to blame the Congress and the Congress guy to blame the BJP person, and they think they are being great anchors. The need of India today is not to see how the politicians can pass on blame to each other and confront with each other and try to find escape route. The need in India is today is how do you bring about consensus between the politicians on certain core values? That is the need. It's a shame that not a single TV anchor is able to recognize it. And that more the confrontation between politicians, the more pride the anchors take. And nobody protests. So unless we start thinking about governance and how do we improve governance, we will have no hope. And this is a subject of another discussion altogether, so I will not go into details. All I would like to say in conclusion is that if we build a society which is based on good governance, and the governance is based on certain core values, if we build a society where the Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, upper caste, lower caste, everybody learn to work together in a very creative way, if we build a society where there is a scientific temperament and that temperament is further moderated by philosophy, if we do these three things, all other problems will take care of themselves. You don't have to worry about roads and railway and stock market and rupee and all of that. So I hope, Mr. Kelapuri, next time you will tell any Indian political friends of yours that building a good Indian society, building a society, Indian society based on scientific temperament, strong commitment to science, building a society based on creative cooperation between our society, building a society based on good governance is a lot more important than scoring point on the fall of rupee. Thank you.